Baby, please, let me just put the tip. I won't go all the way in. You are my wife, and I've told you this a million times. You must open your legs for me whenever I ask you to, no matter the place or time. That was what Tony was saying as he moved closer to Tina's hospital bed. His voice was not loud enough, but he had this desperacy and urgency in it. It's like you are not listening to me, woman. I said you are my wife. You should be able to open your legs whenever I ask you to, no matter the place or time. Tina opened her eyes. She was looking very tired and pale from the procedure she had undergone just a day before. Her body was in serious pain and she had no more energy to even speak to Tony. She could barely keep her emotions in check. She frowned at him, looking at him as she adjusted the thin hospital blanket over her legs. "Tony," she said gently. Her voice was shaking in disbelief, even though she was not so shocked. "What are you even saying?" Tony sighed and moved closer to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm talking about us, Tina. You are my wife. Isn't it my right? We've been married for 5 good years and it feels like it's been so long since I entered in between there." Her heart was not at rest as she sat up slightly, ignoring the sharp pain in her abdomen. "Tony, this is a hospital now," she said. Her voice was shaking. "I'm recovering. How can you even think about that right now?" "It doesn't matter where we are," Tony replied. His tone was strong and loud. "You are my wife. I've waited long enough. I'm just asking for the tip. I won't go all the way in." Tina's lips was trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. "Tony, I just had a procedure. I can barely move and you are talking about this. What's wrong with you?" Tony stood up. His frustration was all over his face. "What's wrong with me? No, what's wrong with you? You always have an excuse, Tina. First, it was the pregnancy, then the baby, and now this. What about me? Don't I matter?" Before Tina could respond, the door opened and a nurse walked in. She stopped, sensing the tension in the room. She looked at Tony's rigid stance, then to Tina's tear-streaked face. "Is everything okay in here?" the nurse asked. His voice was calm but firm. Tony hesitated, looking at her, then back at Tina. "We are fine," he said quickly. "No, we are not," Tina whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at the nurse with a pleading eyes. "He won't leave me alone. He just doesn't listen." The nurse stepped closer, her presence grounding the room. She placed a comforting hand on Tina's arm. "Sir, your wife needs rest and support right now, not pressure. I think it's best if you step outside for a minute." Tony opened his mouth to argue but stopped. His shoulders slumped and guilt was written across his face. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Tina let out a shaky breath. The nurse's reassuring hand still on her arm. "You are safe now," the nurse said gently. Tina nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Tina first met Tony at her cousin's wedding. It was a bright and lively afternoon with music filling the air and the smell of jollof rice wafting from the buffet. Tina was sitting with her cousins laughing at an inside joke when she noticed a tall man walking confidently towards their table. His smile was wide and charming, and his eyes had a mischievous twinkle. "Hello, ladies," Tony said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter around them. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I couldn't help noticing the most beautiful woman in the room." His eyes were fixed on Tina. Tina felt her cheeks flush as her cousins giggled and nudged her forward. She tried to brush him off politely. "Thank you, but I'm just here to enjoy the wedding." Tony wasn't easily deterred. "A beautiful woman like you? deserve more than just to enjoy the wedding. How about a dance with me? Tina hesitated. She wasn't sure if she liked how forward he was, but his confidence was magnetic. Her cousins were whispering encouragement. So she finally said, "All right, just one dance." As they moved to the dance floor, Tony's charm became even more apparent. He twirled her gracefully, his moves confident but not overbearing. They talked between steps, and Tina was surprised by how funny and engaging he was. By the end of the dance, she found herself smiling at his jokes and feeling unexpectedly comfortable in his presence. "You have a beautiful smile," Tony said as the song ended. "I would love to see it again. Can I call you sometime?" Tina hesitated, but something about his persistence and warmth made her nod. She gave him her number, thinking that even if nothing serious came of it, there was no harm in getting to know him better. The next day, Tony called, not a text, not a casual message, but an actual phone call. Tina was surprised, and their conversation flowed easily. He asked her about her work, her hobbies, and her family. He seemed genuinely interested in everything she had to say, and she found herself laughing and opening up to him. Over the next few weeks, Tony continued to impress Tina. He took her on thoughtful dates, always making sure she felt special. He showed up with flowers, complimented her intelligence, and made her feel like she was the center of his world. Tina's friends and family started teasing her about her new admirer, saying she had finally met a real man. At the time, Tina felt like she had found her Prince Charming. Tony was everything she thought she wanted in a partner: confident, successful, and attentive. She didn't notice the small red flags, like the way he always wanted to decide where they went on dates, or how he subtly steered conversations towards his preference. Back then, it seemed like he was just being a thoughtful partner, someone who wanted to take care of her. A few months into their relationships, Tina started noticing little things about Tony that made her uncomfortable. At first, they seemed harmless, quirks she thought were part of his personality. But over time, they became harder to ignore. One evening, they were planning to attend a friend's birthday party. Tina had picked out a bright red dress that hugged her figure beautifully. She was excited about how confident and happy she felt in it. But when Tony saw her, his expression changed. "Red is a bit too loud, don't you think?" he said, frowning slightly. "Why don't you wear that blue dress I like? You look more elegant in it." Tina hesitated. She loved the red dress, but she didn't want to upset Tony. "I thought this looked nice," she said softly. "It does," Tony said, but his tone was unconvincing. "I just think the blue one is more appropriate." Reluctantly, Tina changed into the blue dress. At the party, Tony complimented her, but Tina couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost a small part of herself by giving in. As their relationship progressed, more moments like this began to happen. Tony always wanted to decide where they went on dates, saying things like, "I know the best place," when Tina suggested trying a new restaurant or going to a movie she wanted to see. Tony would brush it off, saying, "We'll go next time," but next time never came. Tony also had a way of dismissing her opinions in subtle ways. If she shared an idea or a thought, he would smile and say, "That's good," as if opinion weren't serious or worth considering. Tina began to feel small in those moments, but she convinced herself it wasn't a big deal. After all, Tony loved her, didn't he? He brought her flowers, took her on dates, and always told her how beautiful she was. That was enough, wasn't it? One day, Tina's best friend Amaka pulled her aside. "Tina, don't you think Tony is a little controlling?" she asked cautiously. "Controlling?" Tina laughed nervously. "No, he likes things a certain way. He's very thoughtful." Amaka raised an eyebrow. "Thoughtful is one thing, but it sounds like he doesn't let you make any decision." Tina brushed off Amaka's concern, but her words lingered in the back of her mind. Over time, she began to notice how often she adjusted herself to fit Tony's preferences. She changed the way she dressed, the way she talked, and even the way she thought about certain things. But she told herself it was just normal. relationships were about compromise, right? Tony's controlling behavior extended beyond decisions about data and clothes. He started keeping track of Tina's time. If she spent too long at work or with her friends, he will question her, saying things like, "Don't you want to spend time with me?" or "I'm the one who matters most, right?" Tina felt suffocated at times, but Tony's charm always pulled her back in. He knew how to apologize just enough to make her doubt her feelings. He would bring her gifts, take her to fancy dinners, and tell her how much he loved her. And each time, Tina would push her doubts aside, convincing herself that Tony's behavior was just his way of showing love. Tina and Tony's wedding was a dream come true for Tina. The church was filled with flowers. Their families and friends gathered to celebrate, and Tony couldn't stop smiling. He held her hand tightly during the vows, his voice steady as he promised to love and cherish her forever. Tina felt like the luckiest woman in the world, and for a while, everything felt perfect. Their honeymoon in Zanzibar was magical. They stayed in a luxurious beach resort, and Tony spared no expense. They laughed, swam, and shared quiet moments watching the sunset. Tina felt like they were building a beautiful foundation for their marriage. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. When they returned home, Tony's controlling side began to surface more strongly. It started with small comments like, "Why don't you ask me before making plans with your friends?" or "I don't like when you are too late." At first, Tina thought he was just adjusting to married life. But the comments became more frequent and sharper. One evening, Tina had plans to visit her best friend Amaka for dinner. She had already told Tony about it earlier in the week. But as she got ready, he frowned. "You are going out again?" he asked, his tone clipped. "It's just dinner with Amaka," Tina said, slipping on her shoes. "I told you about this." Tony leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed. "You've been spending a lot of time with her lately. Don't you think you should prioritize your husband?" Tina paused, confused. "Tony, it's just one evening. I'll be back in a few hours." Tony sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, go, but don't forget who you are married to." The words stung, but Tina brushed them off. She didn't want to start an argument. That night, she left for dinner feeling uneasy, but she told herself Tony would understand in time. As the months went by, Tony's expectation became more demanding. He wanted her to cook dinner every night, even when she was exhausted from work. If she suggested ordering takeout, he would frown and say, "A wife should take care of her husband. Isn't that what marriage is about?" Tony's control extended to their finances as well. He insisted on managing their joint account, saying he was better with money. Whenever Tina wanted to buy something for herself, he would question it. "Do you really need it? Don't you think we should save for the future?" He would say, even though he had no problem spending money on himself. The worst part, however, was the intimacy. Tony seemed to believe that marriage gave him unlimited access to Tina's body. He would often approach her late at night, even when she was visibly tired. "I'm your husband," he would say, his tone firm. "This is part of being married. It's not something you can say no to." Tina hated how those words made her feel like an object, not a partner. But she rarely said no. She didn't want to upset him, and she told herself it was her duty as a wife. She thought things would get better with time, but instead, the pressure only grew. When Tina found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. She couldn't wait to tell Tony, imagining how excited he would be. And at first he was. He hugged her tightly, his face lighting up with pride. "I'm going to be a dad," he said, grinning. "This is the best news ever." For a little while, things felt better. Tony was attentive and sweet, making sure Tina ate well and went to her doctor's appointment. But as her pregnancy progressed, his old behavior resurfaced. One evening, Tina was lying on the couch, her back aching and her feet were swollen. She had spent the day cleaning the house because Tony didn't like seeing clutter. When he walked in, instead of thanking her, he frowned. "Why isn't dinner ready?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. Tina sat up, wincing. "Tony, I've been cleaning all day. I was hoping we could order something tonight. Tony frowned deeply. Cleaning is good, but a wife's first responsibility is her husband. Don't let the pregnancy make you forget that. Tina stared at him, her heart sinking. Tony, I'm exhausted, she said softly. Can't you understand that? Tony sighed and walked to the kitchen. Fine, I'll make something myself, he said, but his tone made it clear he was very annoyed. As Tina's pregnancy progressed, she began experiencing sharp pains in her lower abdomen. Her doctor told her to rest as much as possible, warning her that over-exertion could lead to complications, but Tony didn't seem to take it serious. One night, as Tina lay in the bed, struggling to find a comfortable position, Tony climbed in beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder and kissed her neck. Tony, Tina whispered, her voice tired. I'm not feeling well. I just want to sleep. Tony sighed, his frustration evident. Tina, you've been saying no a lot lately. I'm your husband, remember? Don't you think I have needs too? Tony, please, Tina said. Her voice was breaking. I'm in pain. Can't you just let me rest? But Tony didn't stop. He leaned closer, his tone growing firmer. You always have an excuse. First, it was the morning sickness. Now is this. How much longer am I supposed to wait? Tina felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't have the energy to argue. She gave in, hoping it would be over quickly. But the next morning, the pain in her abdomen was unbearable. She was rushed to the hospital where the doctor informed her that she had developed complications. They performed an emergency procedure to save both her and the baby. As Tina lay in the hospital bed, weak and scared, she couldn't stop thinking about how she had gotten there. She realized that her silence and sacrifices had brought her to this point, and she vowed that things had to change. As Tina lay in the hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling, her body felt weak and battered, but her mind was racing. The sharp pain that had gripped her the night before was gone, replaced by a dull ache and a deeper, heavier sadness. She turned her head to the side and saw Emeka, her little baby, sleeping peacefully in the bed beside her. He was so small, so fragile, and yet he was the only thing giving her the strength to hold on. Tony walked into the room, his face a mixture of worry and guilt. He carried a bucket of flour, but Tina barely looked at it. Her heart clenched as she remembered the events that had led her to the hospital. How are you feeling? Tony asked softly. Tina turned her head away, staring at the window. I'm alive, she said flatly. Tony sighed, pulling a chair to the bed. Tina, I didn't mean for this to happen. He paused, searching for the right words. I didn't know it was this serious. Tina turned back to him, her eyes filled with tears and anger. You didn't know? Tony, I told you I was in pain. I begged you to let me rest, but you didn't listen. You never listened. Her words hit Tony like a slap, and he leaned back to his face pale. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said weakly. I thought it was normal for a husband to expect. Expect what? Tina interrupted, her voice trembling. To expect me to give you my body even when I'm in pain. To expect me to ignore my own health just to make you happy. Tony, this isn't love. This is selfishness. Tony sat silently, his hand clenched into his fist. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew Tina was right. He had been selfish, blind to her pain and needs. The tension between Tony and Tina didn't ease after the hospital incident. Tina focused all her energy on recovering and taking care of her son Emeka, barely speaking to Tony unless it was absolutely necessary. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him, not yet. The pain of his words and actions was still too fresh. Tony, on the other hand, felt lost. He knew he had hurt Tina deeply, but he didn't know how to make it right. He had always thought of himself as a good husband. He worked hard, provided for his family, and loved Tina. But now, he was beginning to realize that love wasn't enough, not if it came without respect. That night, Tony lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about everything Tina had said, and for the first time, He truly understood the depth of the damage he had caused. He thought about his father, a man who had always demanded obedience and control, and his mother, who had silently endured it all. Tony had always admired his father, but now he realized he didn't want to be like him. The next day, Tony made an appointment with a therapist. He didn't tell Tina right away. He wanted to show her through his actions, not just his words, that he was serious about changing. As Tony sat in the therapist's office, he began to unpack years of toxic belief and behavior. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary for Tina, for Emeka, and for himself. Tony's first therapy session was harder than he expected. He sat in the room, shifting uncomfortably in the leather chair as the therapist, an older man named Dr. Carlo, waited patiently for him to speak. The silence felt heavy, but Tony didn't know where to start. How could he explain years of behavior that until recently he hadn't even realized was wrong? You are here because you want to make some changes, Dr. Carlo said gently, breaking the silence. That's a good first step. Why don't you start by telling me what brought you here? Tony took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the armrest of the chair. My wife, he said finally. She says I've been selfish, controlling, that I don't respect her boundaries. Dr. Carlo nodded. And what do you think? Tony hesitated. I think she's right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't realize it until recently. I thought I was just being a good husband. And what does being a good husband mean to you? Dr. Carlo asked, leaning forward slightly. Tony frowned, staring at the floor. I don't even know anymore, he said honestly. I thought it meant providing for my family, taking care of them, but Tina, my wife, she says I've been taking more than I've been giving. And now I see it. The things I've done, the way I've treated her, is not okay. Over the next few months, Tony worked hard to rebuild Tina's trust. He didn't just rely on words. He showed her through his actions. He took over more responsibilities at home, making sure Tina had time to rest and recharge. He listened to her when she spoke, really listened, without interrupting or dismissing her feelings. Seeing how Tony had changed, Tina smiled faintly as she thought about how far they had come. There were still moments of doubt, still times when she felt the weight of her past, but those moments were fewer now. She had learned to speak up, to say no when she needed to, and to prioritize her own well-being without guilt. And Tony had learned to accept that. She turned away from the window, her thoughts shifting to the countless women who might still be struggling in silence. Women who, like her, had been taught that love meant sacrifice, that saying no was wrong, even when their bodies and hearts begged them to. To those women, Tina will say this: it's okay to say no. Your worth isn't measured by how much you give or how much you endure. You deserve to be seen, heard, and respected, even in marriage, especially in marriage. Tina's story is a reminder that marriage isn't about controlling or entitlement. It's about partnership. It's about listening, respecting boundaries, and understanding that love doesn't mean always saying yes. To the woman reading this, you have the right to say no. Your body, your heart, and your mind are your own. And no one, not even your husband, has the right to make you feel otherwise. Love is about mutual respect, not obligation. It's okay to stand up for yourself, even when it feels hard. You deserve a love that uplifts you, not the one that drains you. And to the men reading this, love isn't about faking. It's about giving, listening to your partner, respect her needs, and remember that a strong marriage is one where both partners feel valued and supported. Let this story be a call to action for all of us to do better, to build relationships that are rooted in respect, and to teach the next generation that saying no is a right, not a rebellion. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start a conversation about what real love looks like and how we can all work to build it together. Thank you so much for watching. And please, don't forget, share this story with your family and your friends who might love to see them. Till I see you again, in my next story. Goodbye.